Chapter 3. The Martyrdoms at Cordova. Abdurrahman ibn Muayya landed in Spain with 750 Berber horsemen in May 756. The Caliphate of Cordova may be said to begin with this date, though it was many years before the new sultan had settled his power on a firm basis, or was recognized as ruler by the whole of Muslim Spain. During the 45 years of civil warfare which intervened between the invasion of Tariq and the landing of Abdurrahman, we have very little knowledge of what the Christians were doing. The Arab historians are too busy recounting the feuds of their own tribes to pay any particular attention to the subject Christians, but we may gather that the latter were, on the whole, fairly content with their new servitude. The Muslims were not very anxious to proselytize, as the conversion of the Spaniards meant a serious diminution of the tribute. Those Christians who did apostatize, and we may believe that they were chiefly slaves, at once took up a position of legal, though not social, equality with the other Muslims. It is no wonder that the slaves became Mohammedans, for, apart from their hatred for their masters, and the obvious temporal advantage of embracing Islam, the majority of them knew nothing at all about Christianity. The ranks of the converts were recruited from time to time by those who went over to Islam to avoid paying the poll tax, or even to escape the payment of some penalty inflicted by the Christian courts. One thing is noticeable. In the early years of the conquest, there was none of that bitterness displayed between the adherents of the rival creeds to which we are so accustomed in later times. Isidore of Beja, the only contemporary Christian authority, though he rhapsodizes about the devastations committed by the conquerors and complains of enormous tributes exacted, yet speaks more fairly about the Muslims than any other Spanish writer between the 14th century. If he hates the conquerors, says Dozy, he hates them rather as men of another race than of another creed. And the marriage of Abdulaziz and Eglona awakens in his mind no sentiment of horror. On the whole, the condition of the mass of the people, Christian or renegade, was certainly preferable to their state before the conquest. Those serfs who remained Christian, if they worked on state lands, paid 1/3 of the produce to the state. If on private lands, 4/5 to their Arab owners. The free Christians retained their goods and could even alienate their lands. They paid a graduated tax varying from 13 pounds to 3 guineas. In all probability, the Christians under Muslim rule were not worse off than their co-religionists in Galatia and Leon. A signal proof of this is afforded by the fact that, in spite of the distracted state of the country, which would seem to hold out a great hope of success, we hear of no attempts at revolt on the part of the subjected Christians in the 8th century, except at Beja, where the Christians seem to have been led away by the ambition of an Arab chief. They were even somewhat indifferent to the cause of their co-religionists in the north, and the attempts which Pelayo and his successors made to induce them to rise in concert with their brethren met with but scant success. There can be no doubt, however, that the good understanding which at first existed between the Muslims and their Christian subjects gradually gave place to a very different state of things, owing in no small degree to the free Christians in the north, whose presence on their borders was a continual menace to the Muslim dominion, and a perpetual incentive to the subject Christians to rise and assert their freedom. Our purpose now is to trace out, so far as the scanty indications scattered in the writers of the time will allow, the relations that existed between the two religions during the 275 years of the Caliphate, and the influence which these relations had upon the development of the one and the other. It will be agreeable to the natural arrangement to take the former question first, with a view to the better understanding of the position of Christianity and Mohammedanism at the very beginning of our inquiry. We have thought it advisable to point out in a preliminary sketch the development of Christianity in Spain previous to the period when the Muslims, fresh from their native deserts of Arabia and Africa, bearing the sword in one hand and the Koran in the other, possessed themselves of one of the fairest provinces of Christendom. This having been already done, we can at once proceed to investigate the mutual relations of Christianity and Mohammedanism in Spain during the 300 years of the Caliphate of Cordova. It was in fulfillment of a supposed prophecy of Muhammad's, and in obedience to the precepts of the Koran itself, that the Arabs, having overrun Syria, Egypt, and Africa, passed over into Spain, and the war from the very first took the character of a jihad, or religious war, a character which it retained with the ever-increasing fanaticism of the combatants until every Mohammedan had been forced to abjure his creed or been driven out of Spain. But, as we have seen, the conquest itself was singularly free from any outbursts of religious frenzy, though, of course, there must have been many Christians who laid down their lives in defense of all that was near and dear to them, in defense of their wives and their children, their homes and their country, their religion and their honor. One such instance, at least, has been recorded by the Arab historians, when the governor and 400 of the garrison of Cordova, after 3 months' siege in the church of St. George, chose rather to be burnt in their hold than surrender upon condition either of embracing Islam or paying tribute. Omitting the story of the fabulous martyr Nicholas as being a tissue of errors and absurdities, the first martyr properly so called was a certain bishop named Anambad, who was put to death by Otham ibn Abi Nasa, 727 to 728, a governor guilty of shedding much Christian blood, if Isidore is to be believed. 15 years later, a Christian named Peter, pursuing very much the same tactics as the pseudo-martyrs in the next century, brought about his own condemnation and death. He held a responsible post under government, that of receiver of public imposts, and seems to have stood on terms of friendship with many of the Arab nobles. Perhaps he had been rather lax in his religious observances, or even disguised his Christianity from motives of interest. However, he fell sick, and thinking that his life was near its end, he called together his Muslim friends, and thanking them for showing their concern for him by coming, he proceeded, "But I desire you to be witness of this, my last will. Whosoever believeth not on the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, the consubstantial Trinity, is blind in heart, and deserveth eternal punishment, as also doth Muhammad, your false prophet, the forerunner of the Antichrist. Renounce, therefore, these fables, I conjure you this day, and let heaven and earth witness between us." Though greatly incensed, as was natural, the hearers resolved to take no notice of these and other like words, charitably supposing the sick man to be light-headed. But Peter, having unexpectedly recovered, repeated his former condemnation of Muhammad, cursing him, his book, and his followers. Thereupon he was executed, and we cannot be altogether surprised at that. Besides these two isolated cases of martyrdom, we do not find any more recorded until the reign of Abdurrahman II, May 822 to August 852. In the second year of this king's reign, two Christians, John and Adolphus, making public professions of their faith and denouncing Muhammad, were put to death on September 17th, 824. This is the first definite indication we have that the toleration shown by the Muslims was beginning to be abused by their Christian subjects, and there can be no reasonable doubt that this ill-advised conduct on the part of the latter was the main cause of the so-called persecution which followed. But besides this fanaticism on the part of a small section of the subject Christians, there were other causes at work calculated to produce friction between the two peoples. During the century which had elapsed since the conquest, the Christians and Mohammedans, living side by side under the same government, and one which, considering the times in which it arose, was remarkable no less for its equity and moderation than for its external splendor and magnificence, had gradually been drawn closer together. Intermarriages had become frequent among them, due in part, no doubt, to the marriage of captives, also known as the maiden tribute. And these proved the fruitful cause of religious dissensions. Accordingly, we find that the religious troubles in the reigns of Abdurrahman II and Muhammad I, 852 to 886, began with the execution of two children of mixed parents. Nunillo and Elodia were the children of a Muslim father and a Christian mother. Their father was a tolerant man and, apparently, while he lived, permitted his children to profess the faith of their mother. On his death, the mother married again, and the new husband, being a bigoted Mohammedan, and actuated, as we may suppose, by the odio vitrici, immediately set about reclaiming his stepchildren to the true faith of Islam, his efforts in this direction leading him to ill-treat, even to torture, the young confessors. His utmost endeavor to effect their conversion failing, he delivered them over to the judge on the charge of apostasy, and the judge to the executioner, by whom they were beheaded on October 21st, 840. Though there were some cases of martyrdom of this character, where the sufferers truly earned their title of martyrs, and we may believe that all such cases have not been recorded, yet the vast majority of those which followed in the years 851 to 860 were of a different type. They were due to an outbreak of fanatical zeal on the part of a certain section of the Christians, such as to overpower the spirit of toleration, which the Muslim authorities had so far shown in dealing with their Christian subjects, and to raise a corresponding tide of bigotry in the less enlightened, and therefore more intolerant, masses of the Mohammedans. The sudden mania for martyrdom, which manifested itself at this time, is certainly the most remarkable phenomenon of the kind that has been recorded in the annals of the Christian Church. There had been occasional instances before of Christians voluntarily offering themselves to undergo the penalty of the laws for the crime of being Christians. One such instance in the case of a Phrygian named Quintus had caused grave scandal to the church of Smyrna for having gone before the proconsul and professed himself ready to die for the faith, when the reality of the death which he courted had been brought home to him by the sight of the wild beasts ready to rend him. The courage of the Phrygian had failed, and he had offered incense to the gods. Africa also had had her self-accused martyrs. But the Spanish confessors have an interest over and above these, both by reason of their number and the constancy which they displayed in their self-imposed task. Not a single instance is recorded, though there may have been some such, where the would-be martyr, from fear or any other cause, forewent his crown. Moreover, these martyrdoms, by dividing the church on the question of their merit, whether, that is, the victims were to be ranked as true martyrs or not, and giving rise to a written controversy on the subject, has supplied us with ample, if rather one-sided, materials for estimating the provocation given and received on either side. As time went on, and the Christians and Muslims mingled more closely together in political and social life, the Church, no doubt, suffered some deterioration. Every interested motive was enlisted in favor of dropping as far as possible out of sight those distinctive features of Christianity which might be calculated to give offense to the Muslims, of conforming to all those Mohammedan customs which are not in the Bible, expressly forbidden to a Christian, and generally of emphasizing the points on which Christianity agrees with Mohammedanism, and ignoring those far more important ones in which they differ. The Muslims had no such reason for dissembling their convictions or modifying their tenets. Consequently, a spiritual paralysis was creeping upon the Church, which threatened in the course of time, if not checked, to destroy the very life of Christianity throughout the peninsula. The case of Africa, from which Islam had extirpated Christianity, showed that this was no imaginary danger. But Spain had this advantage over Africa. It contained a free Christian community which had never passed under the Muslim yoke, where the fire of Christianity, in danger of being swept away by the devouring flames of Mohammedanism, might be nursed and cherished till it could again blaze forth with its former brilliancy. Yet, in Mohammedan Spain, religious fervor was not wholly vanished. It was still to be found among the clergy, and specially among the dwellers in convents. Monks and nuns, severed from all worldly influences, in the silence of their cloisters, would read the lives of the saints of old and meditate upon their glorious deeds and the miracles which their faith had wrought. They would brood over such texts as, "Ye shall be brought before rulers and kings for my sake," and "Every one who shall confess me before men, him will I also confess before my Father, which is in heaven," till they brought themselves to believe that it was their imperative duty to bring themselves before rulers and kings, and not only to confess Christ, but to revile Mohammed. However, the reproach of fanatical self-destruction will not apply, as the apologists of their doings have not failed to point out the first two victims that suffered in this persecution. Perfectus, a priest of Cordova, who had been brought up in the school attached to the church of St. Ascalus, on going out one day to purchase some necessaries for domestic use, was stopped by some of the Muslims in the street and asked to give his opinion of their prophet. What led them to make this strange request, we are not told, but stated thus, barely, it certainly gives us the impression that it was intended to bring the priest into trouble, for it was a well-known law in Muslim countries that if anyone cursed a Mohammedan, he was to be scourged, that is, publicly whipped. If he struck a Mohammedan, he was to be killed. The latter penalty also awaiting anyone who spoke evil of Muhammad, and extending even to a Muslim ruler if he heard the blasphemy without taking notice of it. Perfectus, therefore, being aware of this law, gave a cautious answer, declining to comply with their request until they swore that he should receive no hurt in consequence of what he might say. On their giving the required stipulation, he quoted the words, "For there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect," and proceeded to speak of Muhammad in the usual fashion as a lying impostor and a dissolute adulterer, concluding with the words, "Thus hath he, the encourager of all lewdness and the wallower in his own filthy lusts, delivered you all over to the indulgence of an everlasting sensuality. This ill-advised abuse of one whom the Muslims revere as we revere Christ, and the ungenerous advantage taken of the oath which they had made, naturally incensed his hearers to an almost uncontrollable degree. They respected their promise, however, and refrained from laying hands on him at that time, with the intention, says Eulogius, of revenging themselves on a future occasion. If this was so, the opportunity soon presented itself, and Perfectus, being abroad on an errand similar to the previous one, was met by his former interrogators, who, on the charge of reviling Muhammad and doing despite to their religion, dragged him before the Cadi. Being questioned, his courage at first failed him, and he withdrew his words. He was then imprisoned to await further examination at the end of the month, which happened to be the Ramadan or fast month. In prison, the priest repented his weakness, and when brought again before the judge on the Mohammedan Easter, he recanted his recantation, adding, "I have cursed, and do curse your prophet, a messenger not of God, but of Satan, a dealer in witchcraft, an adulterer, and a liar." He was immediately led off for execution, but before his death prophesied that of the king's minister Nazar within a year of his own. He was beheaded on April 18th, 850. The apologists on insufficient evidence described the death of two Muslims who were drowned the same day in the river as a manifest judgment of heaven for the murder of Perfectus. The example set by Perfectus did not bear fruit at once, but no doubt the evidence which it gave of the ease and comparative painlessness with which a martyr's crown could be obtained was not lost upon the brooding and zealous spirits living in solitary retreats and trying by a life of religious devotion to cut themselves off from the seductive pleasures of an active life. The next victim, a little more than a year later, was a petty tradesman named John, who does not seem to have courted his own fate. He had aroused the animosity of his Muslim rivals by a habit which he had contracted of pronouncing the name of the Prophet in his market transactions, taking his name, as they thought, in vain, and with a view to attracting buyers. John, being taxed with this, with ill-timed pleasantry retorted, "Cursed be he who wishes to name your prophet." He was haled before the Cadi, and after receiving 400 stripes, was thrown into prison. Subsequently, he was taken thence and driven through the city riding backwards on an ass, while a crier was sent before him through the Christian quarters proclaiming, "Such shall be the punishment of those that speak evil of the prophet of God." So far, we have had cases where the charge of persecution brought by the apologist of the martyrs against the Muslims can be more or less sustained, but the next instance is of a different character. Isaac, a monk of Tabanos, and descended from noble and wealthy ancestors, was born in 824, and by his knowledge of Arabic, attained in early life to the position of an acceptor or scribe, but gave up his appointment at the age of 20 in order to enter the monastery of Tabanos, which his uncle and aunt, Jeremiah and Elizabeth, had founded near Cordova. Roused by the tale of Perfectus's death and John's sufferings, he voluntarily went before the Cadi and, pretending to be an inquirer, begged him to expound to him the doctrines of Islam. The Cadi, congratulating himself on the prospect of such a promising convert, gravely complied, when Isaac, answering him in fluent Arabic, said, "He has lied unto you. May the curse of heaven consume him, who full of all wickedness has led astray so many men and doomed them with himself to the lowest deep of hell. Filled with Satan and practicing satanic arts, he hath given his followers a drink of deadly wine, and will, without doubt, expiate his guilt with everlasting damnation." Hearing these and other like chaste utterances, the judge listened in a sort of stupor, of rage and astonishment, feelings which even found vent in tears, till his indignation, passing all control, he struck the monk in the face, who then said, "Dost thou strike that which is made in the image of God?" The assessors of the Cadi also reproached him for striking a prisoner, their law being that one who is worthy of death should not suffer other indignities. The Cadi, having now recovered his self-command, gave his decision that Isaac, whether drunk or mad, had committed a crime which by an express law of Muhammad's merited condign punishment. He was accordingly beheaded, and his body being burnt, his ashes were cast into the river, June 3rd, 851. This was done to prevent the Christians from carrying off his body and preserving it for the purpose of working miracles. Isaac's conduct and fate, Eulogius tells us, electrified the people, who were amazed at the newness of the thing. It was at this point that Eulogius himself began to show his sympathy with these fanatical doings by encouraging and helping others to follow Isaac's example. The number of misguided men and women that now came forward and threw their lives away is certainly remarkable, and seems to have struck the Muslims as perfectly unaccountable. The Arabs themselves were as brave men as the world has ever seen, and by the very ordinances of their faith were bound to adventure their lives for their religion in actual human conflict with infidel foes. Yet they were unable to conceive how any man in his senses could willingly deprive himself of life in such a way as could do no service to the cause, religious or other, which he had at heart. They were quite unable to appreciate that intense antagonism towards the world and its perilous environment which Christianity teaches, that spirit of renouncement of the vanities, nay, even the duties of life, which prompted men and women to immure themselves in cloisters and retreats, far from all spheres of human usefulness. Life under these circumstances had naturally little to make it worth the living, and became all the more easy to relinquish when death, in itself a thing to be desired, was further invested with the glories of martyrdom. The example of Isaac was therefore followed within 2 days, by a monk named Sanctius, or Sancho, who was executed on June 5th. 3 days later were beheaded Peter, a priest of Exegia, Wallabonsus, a deacon of Alipia, Sabinius, and Wistramundus, monks of St. Zoilus, Habentius, a monk of St. Christopher's Church at Cordova, while Jeremiah, uncle of Isaac, was scourged to death. Their bodies were burned, and the ashes cast into the river. Sisandinus of Behaeos found a similar fate on July 16th. 4 days subsequently, Paul, a deacon of St. Zoilus, gave himself up, and the same number of days later, Theodomir, a monk of Carmona, all of whom were beheaded.